Thunderhead by Mary O'Hara, Chapter 3. Promise! Let go of me! But he's mine. My tongue's not yours. Ken's voice rose. Shh! Hissed Howard angrily. If you wake Mother. He squirmed and struggled to loosen Ken's legs, which were locked around his waist. Get off my back. Promise not to tell. In furious writhing silence, Howard tried to remove Ken's arms from where they were clasped under his chin. The two boys rolled and bumped about on the floor of Howard's room, their faces scarlet. Promise, exclaimed Ken, even louder. Shh, warned Howard, but Ken was conscious of being in the right. If their father heard the noise and discovered it was because Howard wouldn't promise not to tell about Ken's colt before he had a chance to, Howard would get it in the neck. Promise, promise, promise! All right, I promise. Get off my back. Ken loosened his arms and legs and the boys untangled themselves. In complete amity, their faces recovering normal colour. They straightened their clothing, slickered their hair, tiptoed downstairs and burst out into the day. Bound for the stables and the colt, they paused behind the house at the sight of two strange cars. Visitors brought home to the ranch from the dinner party last night. They recognized the cars. The blue one belonged to Colonel Morton Harris, an old classmate of their father's at West Point, now Colonel of Artillery at Fort Francis Warren. The grey one belonged to Charles Sargent, millionaire horse breeder, owner of the famous racing stud Appalachian. Sargent had his home ranch not 25 miles from the Goose Bar. Charlie Sargent and Mort Harris, said Howard airily. That's keen. No church today. But Ken stood looking at the cars and thinking. Charlie Sargent, tall and thin as a beanpole on his narrow Cheyenne pants, always kidding and clowning, his long brown face under the wide-brimmed western hat looking as Gary Cooper's might when he got older. It was always fun when Charlie Sargent came to visit, and he might talk about his racehorses. Ken's heart felt a little flutter of excitement, and he wanted to know all he could find out about racehorses and Appalachian, the big black racing stud. Come on, said Howard, heading for the barn. Ken walked slowly after him, wondering if the presence of visitors would interfere with his own surprise. Should he tell them at breakfast? It had to be arranged so the impression was favourable. They had to be glad and proud that it was white, as he was himself. That wasn't all. He had really to act so that no one, not even his father, would suspect that he was hiding anything. That was going to be hard. It was hard enough to keep any sort of secret. Harder still if he felt the least bit guilty about it. When they reached the corral, they saw that Flicka and the colt were both out, enjoying the early morning sunshine. Gus and Tim were watching, astonished and amused. Ken rushed at Gus and grabbed him. Don't tell anyone, Gus. They don't know yet. I want to surprise them. Promise? You could knock me over with a feather, Kenny, said the old Swede with his slow smile. But white horses is good luck, they say. Never seen no such colt on this ranch before, added Tim. What'll the captain say? Don't tell him until I've a chance to, insisted Ken. Promise, will you? Sure. You can tell him, Kenny, said Gus. She's your mare, and your colt too, I guess. Ken opened the barn door and called Flicka in. The colt did not follow, but stood blinking in the sunshine. Gus and Tim shooed it gently in. Ken put them both in the farthest stall, and he and Howard stood for a while watching them. But Ken had important business on his mind, and presently ran down to the house and found that his mother was making breakfast and his father upstairs shaving. Ken leaned against the bathroom door and called gently, Dad, hello there. Say, Dad, would you tell me something? Depends. Well, if you had money enough, what kind of fences would you have on the ranch? Well, if I had money enough, I'd tear out every foot of barbed wire and I'd put in wooden fences. Good solid posts about 10 feet apart and 4 feet high. Even one line of rails on top of that would keep horses in. That is, if it was solid enough so they couldn't rub them down with their fannies. Would it cost much, Dad? You can get the poles for nothing up in the government reserve. But the cutting and hauling would cost money. That's work. I wouldn't have time to do it myself. Even if it costs lots of money, Dad, it wouldn't matter. Rob's answer was smothered in the sounds that go with shaving, and suddenly he began his favourite shaving song. Katie, beautiful Katie. It didn't seem as if he was paying a great deal of attention to the important news. Suddenly the door burst open, and he strode out in riding breeches, boots, singlet, and a very gay good humour. His black hair was rough, his eyes very blue, and all his big white teeth showing. He almost rode over Ken, and the boy felt overpowered by the impact of his father's personality. With the door closed between them, it had been less potent. "I'll be waiting for you at the kitchen door," ruled Rob, stamping down the hall towards his room. He stopped at the head of the stairs, looked over and shouted, "Say, you fellows, Mort, Charlie, are you still asleep? Flapjack's coming up." There was an answering shout from the terrace at the front of the house. "We're way ahead of you," and Rob hurried into his room to finish dressing. Outside, Nell and her two guests were being entertained, as was usual at the Goose Bar Ranch, by the antics of assorted animals. Chaps, the black cocker, and Kim, the collie, were chasing each other on the green as if nothing were needed for exuberant happiness but to have been shut up for a night and then let out again. All traces of snow had disappeared. There was intense sunlight breaking everywhere into the colours of the prism. There was a boisterous wind bending the pines and making Nell's blue linen dress flutter. "What do you think of him?" she called to Colonel Harris, who stood near the fountain inspecting Rob's work team. They were huge brown brutes. "That one you're looking at is Big Joe," she added, the pride of Rob's heart. "I should say," said the Colonel, in his cultured, precise manner, taking off his glasses and polishing them, "that he is a pure-bred Percheron, 16 hands high and weighs 1,300 pounds. "Just about right," said Nell, picking up her cat, Paulie, who was begging beside her. Paulie, a sinuous tortoiseshell Angora with long topaz eyes and a little siren face, slipped one arm around Nell's neck, hung on and tried to lick her mouth. Nell tapped the tiny corral, sickle-shaped tongue and laughed. Charlie Sargent's lanky form hovered over her. "You're looking mighty pretty this morning. How do you get those pink cheeks?" "You forget. I've been slaving over the kitchen stove, getting breakfast for, let's see, 5 male men." She buried her face in Paulie's soft brown fur. Charlie Sargent always embarrassed her with his flattering eyes and flirty ways. He made her feel about 18. "Isn't this a day?" she exclaimed. "Who could believe it was snowing last night? That's Wyoming for you." She turned her face up to the sky. There were magpies and plover and chicken hawks gliding on steeply tilted wings against the blue, and now and then, when the wind veered, came a breath of snow from the never-summer range in the south. "Last night," said Charlie, still hovering, "was a mighty nice party. But I'm afraid to face Rob. He bawled me out for dancing with you so much." "This other one," called Colonel Harris, "is not purebred, is he?" "No," said Nell, running down the steps to join him. "That's old Tommy. He's our bronco buster. Whenever Rob has a young horse he wants to take the ginger out of, he harnesses him up with Tommy." While she chatted, she was remembering how furious Rob had been last night when Charlie Sargent had waltzed with her and spun her around and around so fast that her long blue dress had stood out like the skirt of a whirling dervish. All the same, it was fun. The Colonel looked down at Nell with pleasure. His manner was punctilious. "You appear to be fond of cats." "I am, very. At least this cat." "More than dogs?" "I've got it all figured out about cats and dogs. Dogs are like lovable children, but cats are entirely adult." "What about that one over there? She doesn't look very adult." "Oh, that yellow one? That's Matilda. She's just a kitten, but she's really something. She's Paulie's daughter. You'd never think it, would you?" "I certainly would not. Well, if it was after Paulie had a visitor. A tall, thin city cat with long, straight legs. Nothing like our cats. They're like weasels, you see. He was yellow. She usually has litters of 4 or 5, but this time she had only one kitten, and it was enormous. It evidently got all the nourishment that 4 should have had, and it turned into a regular tigress. It took possession of Paulie and the ranch and everyone on it. It explored every cranny of the house, the sheds, the roofs, the chimneys, and it grew like Jack's beanstalk. Rob tells people, if they hear a horse galloping on the roof, not to be surprised. It's just Matilda. Matilda, at this moment, began to take an interest in the Percheron, who had drunk all he wanted at the fountain and was wandering towards the flower border. Nell shooed him away. He paid no attention. She clapped her hands and stamped her foot at him. Get away from there, Big Joe. Big Joe stood his ground. Matilda took a hand. She advanced towards Big Joe belligerently, not too closely, just there to point of his nose, then dashed away again to a spot 4 feet distant. What's doing? Asked Rob, coming through the door. Charlie Sargent laughed. That little yellow devil is teaching the Percheron his place. Look at her. Matilda proceeded to do her stuff. She flung herself on her back before Big Joe, tossing a pebble between her paws. See that? She said to the big brute who was watching her, astonished and fascinated. See that? If you were this pebble, this is what I would do to you. She smacked it from side to side. She chased it when it rolled away. Then, insulting, she went over on her back, held it in her front paws and disemboweled it. Her audience roared with laughter. Look at Big Joe, exclaimed Rob. Look at his face. The Percheron was hypnotized. He hung on every motion of the little yellow ball of fur. Tentatively, he reached out his nose and sniffed, took one slow step. Matilda turned inside out, lit on the pergola, in one more leap was on the roof and galloped thunderously away. Breakfast was noisy. There were flapjacks, thin and brown and light, with slightly crisp edges, piles of them, piping hot. A bowl of brown sugar was on the table, and a jug of maple syrup. With her flapjacks, Nell liked marmalade melted and thinned and hot. By Jiminy, I'll try that, exclaimed Charlie, taking the pitcher. All the time the thought of his colt was never out of Ken's mind. Even while he was watching and listening to the others, he was trying to figure out just how he would tell it. The build-up he had attempted with his father hadn't come to much. Ken wanted to talk to his mother about the things he would like to buy when his colt was winning money on the racetracks. Dresses and velvet things with fur like the general's wife wore, so that they would all fall in love with the colt the moment they saw it because of all it was going to do for them. But as the hilarious breakfast progressed through the grapefruit and flapjacks and sausages and pots of coffee with thick yellow Guernsey cream, and Rob got up again and again to go to the kitchen, and Howard carried piles of plates in and out, Ken became convinced that this wasn't the time to tell it. They wouldn't pay attention, would just say, oh, a new colt, Flicka has foaled at last. Fine. Pass the syrup, will you? After all, there were so many colts born on the Goose Bar Ranch. A car drove up and stopped behind the house. As Rob returned from the kitchen, Colonel Harris said, that's probably the sergeant and orderly with my mare. What for? Asked Nell. Rob explained. Mort wants to have his saddle mare bred by Banner, so I told him to send her up today. It's late for breeding, isn't it? Yes, said Harris, it is. I thought she was bred, but she isn't after all, so we're going to try again. Why don't you have her bred by a real stud? Said Charlie. You don't happen to be ignorant of the fact that my Appalachian is the finest racing stud in horse history, do you? But think what you charge as a stud fee, said the Colonel. $250. That's too much for a poor soldier. What I charge is one thing, and what I get is another, growled Charlie, rolling and lighting a cigarette. Run out, Ken, ordered his father, and tell the sergeant to drive up to the stables and put the mare in the little east corral. She can wait there until I get Banner in. Gee, exclaimed Howard, getting Banner in? Ken went out and saw a car and trailer, 2 uniformed men in the front seat, and a blanketed mare in the trailer. He gave the message and returned to the dining room. Besides, Colonel Harris was saying. Your Appalachian is as pampered and petted and sheltered as a movie star, with his special pasture and meadows and feed and stables for every sort of weather and season. You don't have to think anymore. Everybody thinks for him. Pampered, roared Charlie indignantly. Pampered so that he produces one winner after the other. Country Squire, who won at Tyjorna in 1934, Spinnaker Boone, who won the handicap last year at Santa Anita, and a filly, Coquette, in the 2-year-old class. I know all that, said Colonel Harris. He's a good stud for racing stock. But this tough fellow of Rob's here, Banner, that's the sort of fellow for my money. Thinks for himself, takes care of his mares on the range in all sorts of weather, knows what Rob is thinking and doing a mile away, lives like a robber baron up there in the hills with his harem. Talk about robber barons, said Rob. Remember that stallion they called the Albino? There was a robber baron for you, reigned like a king, no one to think for him. Robbed, pillaged, helped himself to whatever he wanted. What became of him anyway? Asked Colonel Harris. Haven't heard anything about him for years. I'll wager he's around somewhere, lusty and wicked as ever, with a band of mares picked from all over the state, said Rob. And the finest. He sure knew how to pick 'em. You know, we had him in a corral once. Pity someone didn't have sense enough to keep him, said Charlie. If I'd been there. If you'd been there, said Rob sarcastically, it might have been you he ran down and killed instead of me. Ran you down, did he? It isn't often a horse would really attack a man, but he sure did me. We had him in the corral and the whole bunch of mares, including my gypsy and her 4 colts. He never let go of the mares, kept rounding them up, milling them around, heading them in one direction and then the other, until he saw he was licked. They were caught and would never get out. Then he decided to save himself. He went right at one fence, crashed the top bar and was in the wing. I had dismounted. I had a hunch he'd crashed the wire fence too, and I ran to head him off. You know, if you jump in front of a horse and wave your arms, you can deflect him 9 times out of 10. Crosby was coming on his horse as fast as he could, swinging his rope. But that's when the Albino ran me down. He couldn't jump the wing fence, but he charged it and just kicked it to pieces. How did he go? We just stood there and watched his dust. Hurt you any? Asked Colonel Harris, and Rob leaned forward and parted the black hair on one temple. A short white scar showed. I dodged him at the last minute, but he left me a keepsake, one of his front hoofs. Gee, said Ken. And I'll never forget the look of his eyes, continued Rob. I saw them close, too close, a wicked eye. What kind of eye, Dad? An eye like rockets. Charlie, remember that fast black mare I had that you almost bought? You mean that I bought and you almost delivered, corrected Charlie. Rob grinned and turned to Mort Harris to explain. He bought this mare from me for $500, provided I could deliver her safe and sound. She was a hellion, one of the colts out of my mare Gypsy, sired by the Albino. And she had that same wild wicked eye of his with a white ring around it. Well, I got her in the truck, but when we went under the sign out there by the highway, she reared up and brained herself against it. Dad, said Ken, if the Albino was white all over, how could you see that there was a white ring around his eye? In a horse, the pupil of the eye is very large, usually fills the space between the lids entirely. If there's a white ring around it, it is because the eyelids are stretched a bit too wide open. That shows the white eyeball all around and gives that wicked, crazy look. And it always means a bad un. Everybody hates a horse with a white ringed eye. And you've heard about my mohawk, roared Charlie, out of Stowaway by Appalachian. Won everything there was to win at Saginaw Falls 2 years ago. I tell you, Mort, Appalachian. Mort Harris put up his hand. Charlie, I don't want a racehorse. I'm not going to run away from the enemy. I want a horse like Rob's, trained in the hills and high altitudes. I want endurance and good wind and heart for anything. I want to know when I start out on him and he'll bring me back. Stand up under any condition, Besides, Appalachian's black, and I want a sorrel. And you'll get it from Banner, said Rob. He breeds true. Occasionally I get a black colt. His dam was a black Arab mare named Alcantara, but mostly sorrels, one after the other, as like as peas in a pod. Hearing this, Howard and Ken looked at each other. Ken blank and disconcerted, and Howard making fantastic faces of alarm and concern. He mouthed silently, "When are you going to tell him?" And Ken mouthed savagely back, "Shut up." The boys saw their mother's eyes upon them and stopped their face-making. Ken was very thoughtful. The morning was going to be crowded with excitement. Bringing Banner in, breeding the Colonel's mare, he began to feel worried. Events always got themselves tangled around you so that things came out wrong. Perhaps it would be better to save his surprise until all this other stuff was over. Rob added, "And you're right in wanting a sorrel, Mort. A sorrel's the hardest of all to break and train, but when you've done it, and you've got a horse." He pushed his chair back. "What about you fellas riding out with me to get Banner and the mares?" "The mares?" repeated Harris. "Why bring in the mares?" "Banner's the one we want." Rob looked at him, an odd, quizzical gleam in his eye, and Charlie Sargent drawled, "You don't really understand our western broncs, Mort. They're so affectionate. Take Banner now. This tough boy you've been bragging about. Why, it would just about break his heart to be separated from his harem. Rob wouldn't have the heart to do it, would you, Rob?" Harris grinned. "Well, sure. I spend my life on horseback anyway. And now that I'm off on a little visit for a bit of relaxation, I suppose the thing to do is ride some more. I hope you can give me a good mount." Rob turned to Howard. "What horses are up in the corrals now, Howard?" "Taggart, some geldings, Bronze, Shorty, Highboy. Run up there, Howard, and tell Gus to saddle Taggart and Bronze and Shorty." Half an hour later they were in the corrals ready to mount. Charlie Sargent, as always, in his long Cheyenne pants and wide-brimmed hat, and the Colonel as neatly turned out in breeches and boots as Rob himself. "You can have your choice," said Rob generously. "Which do you ride?" asked Charlie suspiciously. "This Blood Bay Taggart. You can have her. You never felt such gaits." Sargent removed his big hat and stretched his head reflectively. "She looks a dandy, and I'm sure obliged to you. But a mare? No. I think I'll take one of the geldings. You take the mare, Harris." "What a grand horse," said the Colonel, looking her over with interest. "All right, I'll take that big mare." He mounted her and settled himself in the saddle. Charlie mounted Shorty and Rob Bronze, and the three men rode out of the corrals together. That's the end of chapter 3.